And I were living in Texas, and I remember at the time Alana was pregnant, and I texted her. I was in town. She was home sick, morning sickness for the day, so she stayed home, and I was in town. And I texted her before I left town. I said, "Hey, hon, how you feeling? How was your day? Anything I can do for you?" And she responded with one word. She said, "Milk." So my mission, I knew, was simple. Get milk. But it's actually more complicated than it sounds. Because maybe some of you remember, but when I was a kid, we had 4 choices when it came to milk. We had whole milk, skim milk, 1%, and 2%. To this day, I'm still trying to figure out what the other 98% is. But we had 4 choices. But now, we have not only cow's milk, and 1%, 2% whole milk and skim, we've also got grass-fed and finished, organic, raw, plant-based, vegan, lactose-free, non-GMO, goat milk, cow's milk, oat milk, soy milk, coconut milk, almond milk, cashew milk, flaxseed milk, and rice milk, and many, many more, and they all come in chocolate. Well, at the time, Alana and I had a friend who worked at a health store, and so they had all of these milks. But she would give us the good stuff, right? We got the raw, organic, straight from the cow milk. It hadn't been processed or homogenized or anything like that, refined nothing. And the best part, she would give it to us for free. I don't know how we got such a deal and made such a good friend, but we did. We would get this milk for free. And when you have such good, tasty, healthy milk available, and you have a pregnant wife at home who's craving that milk, and it's free, you don't come home with anything but that milk. You make sure you get that milk. So I get to the store. And from a distance, I walk into the store and I can see the milk in the back of the store. And there's 1 gallon left. Only 1. And so as I'm walking to the back to grab it, I look to my right and I see a man, most likely on a similar mission. And he's eyeing my milk. Not my milk, Alana's milk. The milk that Alana wanted. So what do you think I did? Obviously, as a Bible student at the time, as a Christian, as a lover of Jesus, I said, "Sir, please, take the last gallon of milk so that your wife can be proud of you and my pregnant wife can be disappointed in me." No, of course not. I pushed over a 5-year-old. I walked fast down the aisle. I lowered my shoulder because I know that in any sport, the low man wins. And I squeezed by him, grabbed my milk, said, "In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, thanks," and got out of there. Now, if you're wondering if I'm exaggerating for dramatic effect, yes, of course, I did not push over any 5-year-olds. He was 6. Now, why? I'm kidding. Now, why did I do that? Why do we do things like that? Why? You guys are laughing because it's shared experience. We've all done things like that. Why? Why do we do that? Because the answer is that putting ourselves first is one of the most natural things that we do. Just like when there's a group photo and you're in it, maybe 5 or more people in this photo, who do you look at first? We look for ourselves. And typically, if we look at that picture, we see ourselves and we look good in that picture, we immediately say, "It's a good picture." Here's a great example. This right here is a really good picture. A really good picture of our young adults group. But we're missing a few. We're missing Grayson and Cassidy and Elijah, Victoria, Bailey, Hudson, Brooklyn, even more. And it wasn't until I started looking at who was missing that I realized this is an awful picture. Half of the people on the left side of the picture aren't even ready. Austin's trying to hide behind Melody there. Yeah, falling, whatever you say. You can't even see baby Casey's face, and Who knows what Nash is doing? But I saw this picture and immediately looked for myself. I was like, yeah, I look good. Good picture. And off I went. Because putting ourselves first is one of the most natural things that we do. And the culture that we live in encourages that self-obsession. Over and over again, the culture we live in says, do what's best for you. Look, take care of your needs. Look out for you. Make sure that you get your me time, right? Focus on yourself because you deserve it. But yet, at the same time, Scripture tells us in Philippians 2 that we are to do nothing out of selfish ambition or conceit. Or in other words, nothing that we do should be done for ourselves. Nothing that we do should be done out of selfish motives, done for us, or vain conceit, but rather, in humility, value others above yourself. Or consider other people's needs more important than yours. God tells us to do nothing out of selfish ambition, and yet the culture that we live in tells us the complete opposite, to put ourselves first. Culture tells us that we must love ourselves first. You have to treat yourself, right? Because you deserve it. Self-care is not selfish, as they say. Live for yourself and don't justify anything that you do to anybody else. And if there's someone that doesn't add to your life, then cut them out of your life. That's what culture tells us. The culture tells us that you have to love yourself first before you can love anybody else. And even worse, I've heard that culture tells us that you cannot be loved unless you love yourself first. And that's just not true. That is absolutely false. We love Jesus because he first loved us. But this is the heartbreaking message that we hear all the time today. And we've become, for the most part, a generation that is obsessed with ourselves. Here's the actual picture. This is much better. But we've become a generation that is obsessed with ourselves. Scripture talks about that. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 and 2 say, "But mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days." Are we in the last days? Well, let's see. Let's see if this describes us. "People will be lovers of themselves and lovers of money, boastful and proud and disobedient." Then down in verse 4 it says, they will be lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power. In other words, people who give off the illusion of being Christians but yet don't walk in the Spirit. And that phrase, people will be lovers of themselves, is hard for us. It's hard for me because most of us, and when I say most of us, I'm saying most of us, are lovers of ourselves. I am a lover of myself. I can be very obsessed with myself sometimes. I often think, what's in this for me if I do this? What am I going to get out of this if I do that? What do I do? What are they going to think of me? And if we're not careful, we can let self-obsession slip into our lives and slip into the church. And we could start falling into a self-centered Christianity. A self-centered Christianity where we know God, we know him in our heads and in our hearts. We know that we're called to love him and love others and serve him and serve others. But yet we live as though God only exists to serve us. We end up loving ourselves more than we love God. We end up loving what we want more than we love God. And if God doesn't do what we think that he should do, we just say, you know what, God, I'll just get it myself. We have become a generation, a culture obsessed with ourselves, obsessed with self-care, obsessed with prioritizing ourselves and guarding our me time, prioritizing and protecting our mental health. We do what's best for us so that we can be as happy as we possibly can be. But yet, haven't you noticed, as a culture, we are more stressed, we are more depressed, and we are more anxious than any other time in history. Why? Maybe the problem isn't that we don't love ourselves enough. Maybe the problem is that we're too obsessed with ourselves. Maybe the problem is that we love ourselves too much. Have I hurt your feelings yet? I've hurt my own. Stepping on my toes, that's for sure. We find ourselves in a culture that is completely backwards from where we're supposed to be. So what do we do as Christians when that happens? We look at what God has given us. We look at the Word, the words He's given us. And we look at Scripture. So in one point in Scripture, someone asks Jesus, he says, hey, Jesus, what's the greatest command? What is the greatest commandment? And Jesus replies in Matthew 22, verses 37, he says, the greatest commandment is love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, okay? That's number one. Love God with everything you have. Not part of your heart, but all of it. Not when it's easy, but all the time. That's number one. Love God with everything you have. He says this is the greatest command, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's commandment number 2. Love your neighbor as yourself. And then he says, all the law and all the prophets, all the scripture that they had in that day, hang on these 2 commandments. Love God and love our neighbor. And how do we love God? With all our hearts, with everything we have. And how do we love our neighbor? As ourselves. Now, some people here, this is where it gets kind of tough. Because some people conclude that there are 3 commandments here. Some people see this as Jesus commanding us to do 3 things. Love God, love our neighbor, and love ourselves. I just don't see that here. I don't see Jesus telling us to love ourselves here as a commandment. I see it as an assumption. I see him as an assumption saying that we already do love ourselves. Like I said, it's one of the most natural things that we do, right? He says, love your neighbor as yourself, or in other words, in the same way that you already love yourself, love your neighbor. He knows that we already look out for ourselves. He knows that we find ourselves first in the group picture. He knows we already love ourselves, and he's not saying prioritize yourself. He's saying the absolute opposite. Prioritize your neighbor. Love your neighbor as yourself, meaning that the way that you care for yourself, the way that we naturally look out for ourselves, the way we flinch to protect ourselves if something's thrown at us, naturally, he says do that for your neighbor. Love your neighbor in the same way that you already love yourself. Now, there may be things about ourselves that we don't necessarily like, right? Like, you might say, I don't like my wrinkles, or I don't like my big belly, or I don't like my long legs, whatever. Some of us might not even like our own personality, and that's tough. Whatever it is, all of us have something about ourselves that we don't necessarily love. Personally, I don't like my nose, and I really don't like my toes. Thankfully, I married a woman who does like my nose. But nobody likes my toes. Even God was like, I do. I have weirdly long toes. I wear a size 9 shoe, but really I wear like a size 5 shoe, and then the rest is just toe. I can pick things up with my toes. I can pick my ring up off the ground with my toes. I can throw a baseball. I can throw a curveball with them. I braid Alana's hair with my toes. I don't do that. This is how you know it's bad. In preparation for this sermon, I asked Alana, I said, do you like my nose? I know it's crooked. It's been broken several times. But do you like it? She said, of course, honey. I love your nose. Of course I do. And I said, okay, I know I've got some weirdly long toes. Do you like those? And she said, they're not that bad. Yeah. And poor Finley, she is the spitting image of her mom. She's absolutely gorgeous, but she got my toes. That's something I don't like about myself. But usually, when there's something about ourselves that we don't like, it's not usually from a lack of self-love, but an abundance of self-obsession. I'm sure most of you, if not none of you, have never noticed how crooked my nose might be. I notice it. My long toes, I notice those, but that's why I keep the dogs in the kennel. I notice it because I'm the one who obsesses over it. But we do. We obsess over ourselves a lot. And all things considered, a Christian, a disciple of Jesus, should not be obsessed with ourselves. Jesus said himself in Matthew 16:24, he said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves." Did you catch that? Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. Paul says in Galatians, he says that I no longer live. My old self was crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And that those who belong to Christ have crucified the flesh, crucified themselves and the desires of the flesh. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 says, he died for all, so that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but live for the one who died and was raised again. Throughout the New Testament, the call to deny ourselves is one of the most repeated themes. But here's the problem. Here's the rub. Here's why I struggled so much with writing this sermon. I struggled with this because I want to get up here and tell you guys to go love yourselves. A lot of us do need to hear that. Some of us are maybe in a really bad place. I want to get up here and to tell you to go treat yourself, to look out for yourself, to put yourself first. Prioritize yourself because that's what feels the best. But when we talk about self-love in the Scripture, well, I've seen it's mostly bad things. It's mostly an example of what not to do. But a friend of mine once told me that whenever someone's talking to him, whenever he's having a conversation and it's going on and they've been talking for way too long, he will check out. He will stop paying attention. And whenever they stop talking, he'll tune back in and he'll just say, well, it's all about balance. And he said a lot of times it works. People have no idea that he checked out. Because a lot of the times, he's right. A lot of the times, it is about balance. So if you're ever talking to me, and I say to you, well, hey, it's all about balance. I wasn't listening. But there's a balance. There's a balance to this. There's a balance to this, and the balance is knowing the difference between self-love and self-care and self-obsession. Self-obsession, we see examples in Scripture. Examples of it in Scripture. Like we talked about earlier in 2 Timothy 2, right? In the end times, there will be lovers of themselves, proud and boastful, disobedient, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. That is self-obsession, and it causes us to like ourselves less. It causes us to have more depression and more anxiety and more stress. That is self-obsession. Loving yourself is different. Genesis 1:27 says that God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. Then a few verses later, he said, and it is very good. You are very good. Loving yourself, respecting yourself, knowing who you are, loving yourself through your flaws, loving yourself the way that you are, knowing your self-worth, honors the artist that made you. The artist that made you said you were knit together. You were fearfully, carefully, and wonderfully made. And he said that you're very good. Who are we to argue with the artist? That's self-love. And self-care. Self-care is taking care of yourself so that you can take care of others. A perfect example of that is Jesus, as always. Luke chapter 5, verse 16, it says, Jesus often withdrew to lonely, quiet places and prayed. Jesus often went and took time to be alone, to recharge. And if the Son of God, God himself in human form, could heal the sick, heal the blind, cast out demons, raise the people from the dead, and calm the storms, the wind and the waves, listen to him. That guy, if he took time to withdraw, if he took time to rest, if he took time to recharge and fill his cup, why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we need that? So take time to renew your soul. Take time to fill your cup, but take time to do it so that you can pour out from the overflow to other people. That's the difference between self-obsession, self-love, and self-care. That's the balance. And as always, Jesus is our perfect example in that. Philippians chapter 2, verse 6 says, even though Jesus, who was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, a thing to be held onto, and instead he emptied himself, taking this form of a servant, right, being born as a man, and he humbled himself to the point, and he became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross, a criminal's death. He emptied himself so that we could be filled. And it says in verse 5 that we're supposed to do the same, to think the same way. So maybe you have been chasing your own version of peace. Maybe you are trying to fill your own cup. Maybe you've been running on empty. I would invite you to come forward and find the one who can make your cup overflow. Let's stand and sing.